Hi, we're back for group 2 today, which we've called Entanglements. Today we're joined by Andrés Jaque and Andrew Holder, if you guys want to wave. Oh, hello. We were supposed to be joined by Aaron Betsky. He unfortunately couldn't make it today, but we hope to bring him back to SCI-Arc soon. What we'll do, okay, so let me just introduce Andrés and Holder and Andrew, sorry, to everybody. Andrés Jaque is an architect, writer, and curator based in New York and Madrid, where he heads the Office for Political Innovation and is the director of Columbia University's Advanced Architectural Design program. He's the chief curator of the 13th Shanghai Biennial for 2020. And this year, Andrés, along with the Office for Political Innovation, published the book Superpowers of 10. His practices work has been collected by MoMA and the Art Institute of Chicago, and he's been awarded the Frederick Kiesler Prize, the Silver Lion for Best Project at the 14th Venice Biennale. Sorry about that. Here we go. Andrew Holder, who is also with us, is the co-principal of the Los Angeles Design Group, the LADG, and is an associate professor of architecture at Harvard Graduate School of Design, where he's the director of the MArch-1 program. Andrew's recent work has been published in Young Architects 16, A+T, Log, Pigeon, and Project. His design work has received numerous design awards, including the 2014 League Prize from the Architectural League of New York, multiple citations from the American Institute of Architects Los Angeles chapter, and the Boston Society of Architects Unbuilt Architecture Awards, not multiple. I want to keep my intro kind of short. The way that I spoke about our panel earlier in the introduction was that we'd be talking a little bit about how things are implied in other things, how queerness may or may not be implied in the work we do as architects or in the sort of apps that we use, the way that cameras and phones or in computer screens imply our bodies or imply a kind of sociality or sexuality, and in the way that buildings themselves are authored by queer or architects in some way. So we're going to start with Andrés, who's going to show clips from 2 films, Intimate Strangers and Pornified Homes. And to the audience, just so you know, after the films stop playing, there's going to be a hold graphic for about a minute because there's a delay between the Zoom and what's playing out there for all of you. So once it's over, just hang on for about a minute. Andrés, do you want to introduce the films to start?
Yeah. Thank you so much, David. I'm really happy to be here, and thank you so much for inviting me. I think this is a very relevant discussion, and I'm happy to be following all the people that spoke earlier today, and also very happy to have the opportunity to discuss with Andrew. We've been talking over the years in different spaces and venues, and I think this is a very relevant discussion for architecture, and definitely for the kind of the way we understand politics now. The 2 films that we're going to see are one is Pornified Homes, which is a short film that we did for the Oslo Architectural Triennale in 2016. We have problems today with triennales and biennales and biennials and triennials.
It's hard to keep it straight. Yeah. It's hard to keep it straight.
Yeah. 2 options, and we get stuck in the middle. So that was exploring the ways of non-belonging as something that was a contemporary condition. And it was, for me, a moment in which I was reflecting on the way gayness and was detaching from queerness in many ways, and queerness was becoming sort of a condition that was situated within a specific sphere of queerness, of gayness, and related to other realities now. And that shift from the 70s or to contemporary times is something that I've been exploring. And the second is Intimate Strangers, which is based on a 2-year research that we did on Grindr. It was the beginning was a commission from the Design Museum in London that launched this exhibition, Fear and Love, on the occasion of their moving to the new location in Kensington, and they invited a number of architects and designers to to select the most important design they wanted to reflect on. And for instance, OMA reflected on the European interiors, the interiors of the European Union. For me, it was crucial at that point to discuss the criticality of Grindr. And in general, the kind of hookup location-based apps, but in particular Grindr, that was after a moment of first sort of empowerment of queerness, for a very particular reason, it turned into a platform of lifestyle platform with Landis Smithers becoming the art director of the entire platform. And it became something totally different. It's the moment that probably we can identify how gay culture in many Western cities became non-queer and actually even a vector for dequeering society. So that is a way to claim the need for new forms of queerness and probably even to rethink the culture of gayness as an opportunity to go beyond and to think of other forms of queerness that now are so needed.
Well, that was a great intro. And just so you know, we're going to see Intimate Strangers first, and then I think Pornified Homes. But yeah, that
Excellent.
Sounds great. Okay. Thank you.
Intimate Strangers.
Joel Simkai was born in Tel Aviv in 1976 and soon migrated with his family to the conservative New York suburb of Mamaroneck. As a teenager in the 1990s, he started participating in what was the then emerging world of online chat services, which he would use to find guys. In the dark of his bedroom, with his parents watching TV in the next room, he would access the CB Simulator's multi-user chat channel 33 and AOL's instant messaging service to immediately connect to a multitude of distant gay guys.
I was gay born online, Simkai says. It was great, but most of the times I would end up talking to guys in places like Wyoming, Minnesota, or Washington, D.C. It was impractical.
When he was 21 and still closeted, he lived for 1 year in Paris as an NYU exchange student. Disappointed by the limited options he found at gay bars in Tel Aviv, where he spent his summers, he was amazed at the effect that a pioneering communication system, Minitel, had on Paris's density of 21,000 inhabitants per square kilometer, which is about 27 times the density of Mamaroneck.
With 9 million users, Minitel, the French predecessor of Internet, had already produced a digital language for online dating. It consisted of a video text system that provided interactive content which it displayed on a video monitor. Even though it required its users to engage with an unwieldy device that had to be wired to a fixed phone line and placed in the user's room, the high number of Minitel users made it possible to extend the text screen conversations into offline encounters and sexual intercourse.
In 2008, as cell phones with GPS were being launched by Apple, Samsung, and Nokia, Simkai, Morten Beck Diddleson, and Scott Llewellyn developed in over 6 months the first version of a location-based application that they called Grindr, a name composed by combining guy and finder. It was designed to help gay men easily find other gay men in close proximity. In June 2009, on the BBC Two show Top Gear, the British actor Stephen Fry showed Jeremy Clarkson how easy Grindr made it to cruise nearby gay men. A week later, 40,000 men had downloaded the app.
For Jaime Wu, it was like gaining Superman's X-ray vision and suddenly being able to peer through brick and steel to reveal all the hungry men around. People use the term gaydar to refer to a queer man's ability to sense another man as a fellow queer. Grindr felt like a literal radar. In its free version, Grindr opens with a display of 12 photographs of the closest individual users, with their names on the lower left corner. The profiles shown can be filtered by age, body metrics, ethnicity, preference in sexual position, relationship status, also by the way users define themselves as aligned with one of 12 tribes: bear, clean-cut, geek, jock, leather, otter, rugged, twink. Scrolling down reveals up to 100 nearby users, who are often shown shirtless or naked.
The alkali aluminosilicate glass screen of cell phones provides a texture similar to smooth skin, so that as you rub your thumb down the display of Grindr users, it is like touching the young, hairless skin of a naked body. The display promotes interaction. Blocking, favoriting, and messaging is the next step. By tapping on a picture, the profile grows to occupy the whole screen. A user's profile consists of the guy's distance, his age, body metrics, and intentions, a headline, and 120-character About Me section. These are the features guys use to construct themselves in Grindr.
What's up? What are you up to? What you into? Where you at? Trying to meet people. Are you interested? What are you looking for? Visiting. Looking for someone to show me round. Have more pics? Show me your dick. Are you a bottom? Wanna fuck?
Hunter says nothing matters on Grindr besides the picture. Grindr conversation tends to be simultaneously casual and intimate. It accelerates sexual serendipity by creating a space of visually driven, pre-agreed normativity. The 309 version of the app, released in October 2016, removed the orange frame in its interface to avoid users being exposed when checking Grindr by the orange glare coming from their cell phone screen, coloring their faces. Grindr is a zone of its own, one different from cities, enacted more than constructed, but one that is also part of the way our offline world is now being constructed.
Predictions made in the 70s on the way digital interaction would result in the unimportance of proximity have been proven false. With 10 million users in 192 countries, growing at a rate of 10,000 daily downloads, Grindr produces a flow of more than 70 million messages a day. It's not only in the dark of bedrooms, but in offices, bars, streets, trains, factories, gyms, and colleges that people inhabit it. Jeff Fazocco says he needs Grindr to have a sense of who is in the room. For people like Fazocco, urban experience is no longer possible without the X-ray vision locative media provides.
If places, bars, clubs, saunas, cruising spots used to be what produced LGBT scenes, it is now the self-reconstruction of subjects through online editing and circulation that host gayness. Grindr constitutes a sexualized transnational urbanism made in the intersection of bytes and flesh that comprises 5 trillion bytes of data in use, stored in servers located in 23 sites in only 2 countries, the US and China. The management of functional dispersion and bodily reconstruction is actually concentrated in a binational location. Grindr pioneered what became a diverse context of proximity-based social media, including Badoo, Blender, Blued, Down, Glimpse, Happen, Hinge, Jacked, JS Wipe, Pure, Tinder, Scruff, among many others that have not only radically changed the way sex and love are currently understood and experienced, but have also altogether enrolled more than 360 million people around the world in a process by which self-construction replaces building and intimacy among strangers reinvented urbanity.
Cruising spots and dark rooms all around the world have seen their constituencies reduced and aged in the last years, when younger generations abandoned grittiness and found digital spaces to flirt and negotiate sex. In London, historical gay venues like Black Cap and Joiners Arms awoke media concern when they were demolished to make room for apartments. In New York, West Village's Westway Club closed in 2015 to be replaced by condominiums. Savon Zebar, owner of the Latino gay club Escuelita, claimed that his club had been shut after 49 years because minorities did not fit into the gentrification plans of the city. Still, locations like Hell's Kitchen or the West Village, which are on the front lines of gentrification, are reported by Grindr users as favorite locations to find guys during the daytime.
In Western countries, the growing normalization of LGBT realities has made historical sites of queer empowerment lose their role in accommodating the marginal and have now become spaces of aspirational real estate. If the queer movement has historically challenged couples as the respectable form of sexual allocation and has claimed nightlife and trash as spaces for social justice, the one-to-one relationship that Grindr's interface prioritizes and the progressive replacement of gritty venues by light apartments happening in former gayborhoods mark an evolution by which gayness is less the alternative, but rather an actor in the making of the mainstream.
Intimate strangers.
Bruno's profile on sleepyboy.com presents him as a Brazilian man available for paid sexual encounters in his apartment. He grew up with his mom and siblings in a favela in Rocinha. When he was a kid, his mom called him Bam Bam, after the Flintstones' sweet and strong kid character. At 14, he moved to Rio de Janeiro and decided to get the name Bam Bam tattooed on his forearm. In Rio, he lived on the streets for 2 years. Using the parallel bars at the street gyms and inspired by his late cousin who was muscular, he began to sculpt his body. He had his mom and siblings' faces tattooed on different parts of his body as a way of bridging the distance between himself and his loved ones. He was already a good dancer when a religious organization took him to a children's shelter where he lived for a while and learned to play guitar and drums. While dancing at the carnival, someone invited him to move to London, where he ended up marrying a British lawyer. They communicated with Google Translator until Bruno, with the lawyer's help, could speak English. This opened up many opportunities, and Bruno started dancing at the Spin Flow club called Heaven. 4 years later, his videos on YouTube, which involve him dancing, have millions of views, and he is regularly invited to dancing clubs in Hamburg and Ibiza. He uses one cell phone to communicate with his clients in the UK and Germany, a second one for storage and to play the music he uses for dancing, and a third used only for WhatsApp to contact his mates and relatives in Brazil. Sex clients, dancing, and loved ones in Brazil remain independent realms in the way Bruno distributes them among his 3 cell phones. About his clients, Bruno says, "In the UK and Germany, people love Brazilians. They think we rock the world in a good way, that we are beautiful and sexy. My clients want to know more about my tattoos, my life in Rio. They love to take me to their homes. It makes them think that their life is fun and sexy." Bruno lives with his dog Eros in a small apartment at the rear part of a fancy building in Kensington. He needs to live in a central and prestigious part of London. This helps clients feel comfortable. He is turning his 28 square meter apartment into what he calls a pornifying stage. 1 year ago, he added a plinth to his window. He can now jump from a platform on top of his washing machine onto a tatami and then slowly move to the end, leaning on the wall. He has already installed a sound system, and soon the lights and cameras will arrive. Bruno's society is one built to make it possible for clients in the UK and Germany to bring sexiness into their daily lives. It is a complex assemblage of demarcations that can only remain together through the mediation of independent phones, tattoos, and staged interiors, and that are reprogramming London's central and prestigious neighborhoods into networks of transnational daily life pornification. Central London, so many times narrated as the hub of the globalized, post-states-oriented government, contains an ecosystem of shady backyards and down-rated basement apartments. This is a transnational urbanism that is not built out of blocks, roads, and institutional buildings, but rather composed of the way humans bereft of economic power are displaced and then sexualized by the way their offline existence is pornified through online projection. Colonial creation of a geography of center and periphery might now be replaced by a layered coexistence in which the architecture of properness, the one that accommodates law firms, wealthy residences, and corporative headquarters, contains a secluded and sexualized backyard architecture of otherness. We might have never been global. We inhabit the way transnational constellations negotiate their articulation with each other. It might be in the way our skins, texts, WhatsApps, desires, loved ones, domestic interiors, unfamiliar interaction, and sound systems get together where we can find the urbanism we now live by.
That was beautiful, and I realized we saw a clip from both films, not the full films, but that was. It's funny to watch those, and even it's funny also to see like even the Grindr interface looks dated already. Like these things have already moved on, and I think you mentioned in that film in Intimate Strangers even how the app at some point they tried to. Started to have like community events, a magazine or something, a video channel, but then I think they stopped doing all that as well at some point. And it's super strange. But I was curious, like when you're doing even the research for both films, like the process of doing that research and then also trying to put the films together, if you could describe that a little bit, just more mostly out of curiosity.
Yeah, I think there's a huge void in the capacity for architecture to operate in the technologies that are allocating politics now. And I think that it's very important to understand that the relevance of architecture very much depends on our capacity to research. I consider myself a designer, and our office is a design office. But design, as we could say of many other disciplines, require to permanently identify what is the site where we're operating. And the site is no longer, for architecture, I think, something that it's a patch in the voided patch in the urban fabric, but it's, for me, it's a system of entanglements. And that is why I love the title you gave to this section. When we work in these realities, we're basically making space for us to operate in it, identifying what is the way that these milieus are organized. And in both cases, they were milieus that were in the sifting, were changing very rapidly. All of them keep changing, because they were constructed in the entanglement of bodies, online infrastructures, offline spatial arrangements and settings. And those settings were evolving very rapidly, both the bodies and the online interaction and the physical space, or let's say everything's physical, the offline space, but mostly the way they relate to each other. And going to your question, the most important for us was to identify what those tensions were. I think architecture is no longer something that occupies space, but occupies entanglements. And this is the side for architecture. It's no longer spatial practice, I would say. It's much more complex than that. And we've seen that with Grindr. It's not about, let's say, space that we can occupy or move around. It's more the way that different bodies relate to each other and what are the other components of those relationships. I think we're entering a moment of architecture being compositional, not spatial. I don't think space is relevant anymore, or not a category that we can work with. But in order to do that, also, second thing is that we cannot have universal assumptions. We have to go to the cases. case by case. And this is something that, of course, our peers from the SDS traditions are telling us, have been telling us for decades now. But now architects, I think that we have to adapt to that. And when it comes to the question of queerness, which is what we're discussing, queerness is mutating very rapidly, and it's very different across the world. This movie, Intimate the Strangers, that I guess can be found in the internet, I'm not sure, but it's been shown in many, many different places and venues. It's something that it's totally different when it comes to queerness or kind of gayness. I think it's very different. Gayness in Chelsea for young people, healthy white people, it's very different than gayness, queerness for people in New York, in other areas that are not necessarily rich, not necessarily young, not necessarily healthy. Like when we move away from heteronormativity and gay heteronormativity as well, we enter a space of queerness, and that border is not that easy to identify. That's what we wanted to identify, which is difficult because I think it's not easy to claim that it's the same now, queerness and gayness. So that border is beside, and that border moves in different locations. In Egypt, it's totally different. In Saudi Arabia, has nothing to do. So that's what we were tracking. And the technology is kind of changing by the way it's associated with other actors in different locations around the world.
Do you think that, I'm curious, like obviously Grindr, it tends towards the male, tends towards sex, et cetera. But I think one thing that sort of comes out of that film is that it also has affected queerness outside of that, just kind of male gayness, let's say, or male sexual gayness, that like all somehow location-based apps kind of affect some sense of like the space of the city and, like you say, the space of architecture. I'm kind of curious, like even as an architect, how that has changed your own work, if at all, or if it can change your work, to think of both, let's say, architecture, like I guess you're saying, is kind of infrastructure and not spatial in that sense. I'm not sure that that's the word you use, but or that somehow it's related maybe to a specific group or not related to a specific group of people.
Yeah. This is a very good question. I think we're no longer in the moment of when, I don't know, people like Eve, Sofsky, Adrian Rich, Teresa de Laurentiis were thinking queerness. I think that we have to look at other authors. I'm very happy that you had today Jack Halberstam. I think we have to very carefully listen to Jack Halberstam's words. I think we have to carefully listen to other people like Paul Preciado, obviously, but also Karen Barrett, Astida Neymanis, Riley Snorton, and the notions of queerness now are very different and are in other locations that they were in the 70s or 80s, I would say. Like if we think, for instance, of the effect that Grindr had and White had that effect, it's very important to pay attention to how it operated in the time that we were doing this film. That's the moment that we're narrating. It's the moment that they wanted to sell the company. And in order to sell the company, it was surprising because Grindr has a value in the stock markets that were really reduced. Like with a huge amount of people, I think at that time it was something like 300 million users around the world. They had a value that was like 10% the value of Uber that was operating in the US and in very limited numbers. So the reason why it all started was this change was because basically Grindr wanted to sell the company and they had a very reduced value. So they hired other people like Landis Smithers and they started to move into this platform of lifestyle as a way to brand themselves. Then they had associations with fashion, with Paper Magazine, or with J.W. Anderson, or with Nicola Formichetti for Diesel. And they were trying to move from being a platform of kind of man-to-man contacts to become a platform of lifestyle that could sell what they called interior design, art, fashion, and sex as something continuous. And they assembled those elements, interiors, art, fashion, and sex together. Of course, when they said sex, they said white, young, healthy men. And that was kind of the package. So by doing that, they basically commodify gayness. They turn it into a very, very much of a one-to-one de-queered space for same-sex interaction. It was excluded other forms of sex, other ages, I remember one of the first conversations I had with the engineers in Grindr, I said, how do you deal with age? And they said, well, we're very welcoming old people. We have maybe something like 10% of our users are in the 40s, in their 40s. And I said, but the 40s is young people. It's not. So so it's, you can, and basically because they were knowing that was a range of high consumption, and they would basically target that part of gayness as something, as a market of high consumption. So basically, but the second part is going to your question, is that immediately it got related to domestic interiors, and in particular with the real estate, the moment of real estate developing all these kind of from glass to ceiling apartments in places like New York, Rome, Paris, London. And that is the moment in which basically Grindr start kind of totally dequeering. Because basically those apartments, as part of the profiles or kind of the photographs of people in Grindr, become something that worked together very well. They started to advertise Grindr as a place where you could find white guys, young guys, in apartments, condominiums with huge views, with amazing views in New York, and that the users reacted to that and started to find that most desirable, and places like Chelsea became in the High Line, the areas of the High Line became, and we could track that with their numbers, like basically these are the places where people would choose to go on a Saturday to switch on the app. So the connection between basically real estate, hegemonies, whiteness, youngness, and Grindr was crucial. And it's very symbolic that those areas were normally places that were sort of left die in cities, and therefore became places for cruising, places where big spaces, industrial spaces, could be used for as nightclubs. And that form of those venues for gayness to be sort of playing a queer role in cities was replaced by something that looked similar, but was exactly the opposite. And then queerness was displaced somewhere else. And the second part, I think, that has to do with this compositional. What was very clever with people like Landis Smithers, that was also the guy that removed the nudity in Playboy to make it family friendly, so they could get more advertisements. Basically, it's what was very clever from them is this compositional aspect. He understood very well that it was important to present bodies as part of interiors, as part of urban settings, as part of fashion, as part of this whole endeavor. They organized these parties in the Liberty Suite in the Standard Hotel, where they would hire artists like Jacoby Satterwhite, that became a very good friend, and we collaborated in a number of projects, to basically compose things together. Like the best, let's say, designers were working to compose bodies, interiors, and that worked very well, but for the wrong interests, I would say, to damage, for those that love queerness, like me, to kind of damage queerness in a very strong way. But they were very clever in understanding that was sex now. Sex is no longer genital interaction. Identity is no longer something that is encapsulated in bodies. It's something that is not zipped up, is not self-contained in bodies, but is something that is assemblage-based and is composed by elements that transition across scales, materialities, and medias. And that condition that is so important to understand as what architecture, contemporary architecture is about, became an arena for queerness. And I think the forms of responding Grindr become from similar compositions that are symmetrical in the way they're constituted. In this, I think that again, the work of people like Jack Halberstam, Stida Neymanis, Karen Barrett, I think it's super important for us to understand that basically there's a new form of activism or a form of activism that is heavily operating as an architecture that challenges the idea of single technologies, of binarisms between kind of nature and artificial, binarisms like architecture and non-architecture, like the call for everything's architecture has a second meaning, which now that it's there's no binarism between architectural and non-architectural. It's precisely in the entanglement of different entities where architecture is now allocated. And I would say that the possibility for queerness to operate architecturally now, it requires necessarily to understand these entanglements as the form of contemporary architecture now.
It almost so it looks like Andrew Holder, there's a storm and his power might have gone out. So hopefully he'll be able to join back ASAP. But in the meantime, it also sounds like you have I'm curious if you could define, like, when you say architectural, what that means to you, because I think it also sort of suggests a different, a slightly different definition of the term to some extent than maybe the way that many other people might think of it. Like it's when for example, when you say away from space towards composition, or you say maybe like infrastructural or entanglements and things like this, like it seems like architectural is less about authorship and desire for beauty or for things being like done in a specific way or relating to kind of some sort of historical canon, but instead architecture is something quite different. And I'm curious if you could like expand on that at all.
I think the notions of architecture that we inherited from modernity that have not been revisited that much were basically based on false assumptions, like the possibility of operating from scratch. I don't think from an ecological perspective that's any longer available. We cannot think of an architect coming to a site and doing anything. It doesn't exist. It's just a lack of accuracy to think in that way. You think like all the components are coming from somewhere else, is traveling. Like there was already something. There were many forms of life there in that particular space or location. So when you see from the 70s, architecture is something that any other form of cultural production, bodily production, needs to be situated. We have to go to the real conditions in which it happens, to the specific ones, not generic abstract notions, but we have to inspect. And that comes, of course, from feminism that gave that contribution to the entire world of culture, technology, interaction, sociology. So basically, when we situate architecture, there's no way to claim that architecture is something that comes out of the blue, that starts from a tabula rasa. It's always an intervention on existing societal constructions. So when you think of marble coming from a mountain being moved to wherever, from Argelia to Barcelona to, like all these things, then things are seen very differently. You're always intervening on something that already exists as the association of many different entities. Right. And we're re-articulating those relationships. That's what architecture is about. The second thing that is crucial is that architecture, being something that is happening, we need to define very well what is the architecture that we can claim as the one that architects do. And I think that that requires certain, let's say, engagements, forms of engagement. And the way to manage them, in my opinion, is very political, but not the politics of, let's say, voting for this or for the other, are politics that have to do with the compositional aspects of architecture. What is that is made available, possible, more likely by doing things in this way, by we're articulating something. What is those actors that become more present? Who are the ones that get empowered? Who are the ones that are differentiated? That game of articulation requires certain political responsibility. And that political responsibility, it's not the kind of any form of politics, is sort of more materially based or material based forms of politics. And when it comes to then think of queerness, we have to acknowledge that there's certain forms of hegemonies are running. And they're very weak, of course, when you look at the cracks. But let's say that for me personally, in the way I think of architecture, architecture is a form of dissidence to these hegemonies. So we could see that there's forms of architecture that are very aligned with real estate hegemony or with heteronormative forms of power or exclusion, with whiteness, with, of course, transphobia, with, of course, exploitation of nature, of people, of others. And there's others that are not doing that, or at least they're part of that, because there's no way probably to get away from all these entanglements, but are intentionally doing moves to operate against those hegemonies and be dissident to the way they operate. For me, that is the notion of queerness. And if we discuss queer architecture, I think queer architecture is a practice that is happening on existing systems of it, or ecosystems of entanglements, and that are operating, challenging the forms of hegemonies and heteronormativities that are operating. And also, when we think of hegemonies and heteronormativities, we have to think of binarisms, and the binarism, nature, artificial, human, non-human, architectural, non-architectural, and we could go on and on, are forms of binarisms that architecture needs to challenge. And those are the kind of lines or kind of arenas in which I think also it's not an option. I don't think that queerness is something of a personal statement now. It's a condition of the world that is disputing others' forms of normativity. And I think that we're all part of this debate. And it has, in my opinion, little to do with necessarily identifying oneself as gay or something like that, but as that was very important and it's still very important in many places, but it's a little bit more complex. It's, I think, something of challenging hegemonies, binarisms that are very much interconnected.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost true. It's also like there's also a way to just look at this, which is also saying that like, just because someone's not gay or queer, sort of what queerness does is allow us to realize that they are a mix of many things, in the same way that architecture, even in your conception, could sort of be thought of as a mix of, there's many ways to sort of think through it rather than the way we've always traditionally thought of it. Andrew, it looks like you're back out of the storm. You made it through your cell phone.
Yeah, there's a hell of a storm here in Boston, and so it seems to have knocked something off of the roof of our building that supplies internet.
Okay. Maybe we can return to this conversation with Andres, and maybe Andrew, why don't you, if you think you can do it, go for it.
We'll just do a little bit of a modified version of what I had in mind. How about that?
That sounds wonderful.
Okay, right. Give me a second to figure out how this might work.
Sure.
There we go. There. All right. So this is my version of sharing a screen. Is it seeable?
Yep.
Okay. Here we go. I will try this. All right. So thanks to David And I'm so sorry to have missed out on the conversation with Andrés. It's always a pleasure to be involved in projects that Andrés is involved in. And I'm just a huge admirer of the work. So I apologize, Andrés, for not being able to join the conversation. I was literally unmuting myself at the moment the internet fell apart. Okay, so I had planned this thing that sort of makes use of cameras and mirrors and things in my apartment. We will do a very low-tech version of the same thing where my version of a screen share is streaming my desktop screen to you from my phone interface. And we'll just kind of see how it goes. But maybe if we take a cue from Jack Halberstam, failing is the best possible outcome. And so I suppose I qualify. All right, so I'll just start. Queer Query is a perfect title for a symposium on queerness in architecture. Congratulations to David for that. Architecture's foundational statement is the perpetually unanswered question, what is architecture? So in a sense, we are all expert at posing and responding to queries. We are also perennially slow and perennially late, maybe because everything we do is measured against processes of design and construction that take years or decades. This latest swell of interest in queerness by architects comes 30 or even 40 years after the first appearances of queer studies in the academy. But there are advantages to being late. Lateness allows us to ask more trenchant and unsettling questions. There is simply more in the rearview mirror to look at, think about, and ultimately to doubt. This is the spirit of what I'd like to say. I'm late and I've got a lot of questions. As for instance, how am I qualified to be here? My sexual practices are queer, but maybe they are just gay. And in either case, I'm not sure an identity derived from this source is a sufficient passport to do queer architecture. I worry about an economy that weighs degrees of marginalization. Is gay sex a marginal enough practice to justify the work that comes out of my office? Here, I should start saying our work, because my work is really the product of an office full of people. Only some of us make any claim to queerness. And what does this economy of marginality predict about the future of practicing queer architecture? As sexual identities are born into the world and are then eventually absorbed and normalized, does that shrink the pool then of possible queer architectures and queer architects? I have similar questions about the identity of queer architecture's audience. Is queer architecture for queer people? What happens if we cannot find or manufacture these communities as clients for our work? And if we can find them, what constitutes a responsible, authentic service to that community? And is it possible that responsible service to these communities runs counter to the potential wildness and irresponsibility of a queer aesthetic project? Both sides of identity, of the architect and of the audience, run aground in essentializing questions that limit possibility instead of expanding it. At the most extreme limit where architecture and audience intersect, might there be a map that tells us who can practice on behalf of whom? Or a system of manners that governs representation, again, who is qualified to speak and practice? I'm more comfortable with analogy. The desires that impel sexual practices can be equivocated to desires that impel a broader array of cultural practices. We disobey and resist, we tease our oppressors to tame them, and we invent ourselves in ways that make systems of categorization do a shocked double take before surrendering entirely. Broadly, we transgress to expand the spheres of human happiness and pleasure. We do wrong and love it. But here's the problem. While the desires that impel our work remain vital, they have settled on a common series of targets. Our rhetorical strategies for disobedience have developed rules and categories of their own. We have developed stable, fairly rigid systems of manners and propriety. We perhaps could never agree on the definition of queerness, but it is easy for us to enumerate a list of things that are decidedly not queer architecture. The list would begin dominant, categorical, stable, model, which would again be easy to populate with imagined identity characteristics, cishet, white, family. And this is a problem. because our collective understanding of the exclusion of these terms means we have insufficiently put ourselves up to the kind of scrutiny we bring to bear on the rest of the world. Maybe queerness needs queering in architecture. We can do this by returning exactly to the categories that seem most illegal, most obviously not a part of our queer enterprise, and then figuring out how to re-include them, on what terms, and by which reconfigurations of our own thinking. I would like to do this by asking three questions of a recent project in my office. It is called House in Los Angeles 5. And I would like to ask here, what is a client? What is a dominant model? And what is the center? So our client for this project is plural, Danielle and Darren. They bought a house in a neighborhood of Los Angeles. They asked us to remodel it. Here's Darren in a state of some despair about the quality of the house that they just bought because it needs sort of extreme renovations, particularly in the guest house, where this is the scene that greeted them after their arrival. I think that there's a particular cartoon of our client, a cartoon of heteronormativity. It's not one that I believe in, but it's one that I think we can articulate fairly easily. So these are straight white people. They're brand new parents. They've commissioned us to build a single family home. And I think it's worth acknowledging that the entire project of the single family home has recently been identified with unsustainable economic and environmental practices and with a history of racial exclusion. I don't think that that cartoon of heteronormativity, however, really bears scrutiny when we start to examine the relationships between the client as a commissioner of a project and what they got in return. So this is the kind of first design document that we began working on for Danielle and Darren. This was our kind of vehicle for thinking through their preferences. It's this huge matrix of possible configurations in plan of the new house. They were first dealing with a set of constraints imposed by the city that if they wanted to reach a certain square footage in the new house, they had to retain certain attributes of the existing one, specifically the shape of certain exterior walls. On top of those constraints given by the city, Danielle and Darren knew that they wanted 3 bedrooms, and there were specific definitions of what constituted privacy and entertainment for them. In terms of square footage, they wanted about 2,000. And again, this was confined by stipulations given by the city. What's interesting about this is that all of the requirements stipulated by Danielle and Darren are easily accommodated in these super abstract representations. So we're just manipulating planimetric footprints. And already there's a kind of incredible, what I would characterize as plasticity to the project that they get in response. So there's no particular determined outcome given their set of stipulations. It's still a pretty open enterprise. So after determining what the project is going to look like in terms of its footprint and plan, we begin working. Our current habit in the office is always to start conceiving of projects as though they're made of boxes and cubes, and boxes in the sense of a kind of cardboard box made of surfaces that can be folded and unfolded. And so we start representing these like possible ways of thinking about the plan of their house, making its way into 3 dimensions. But through the kind of office idiom of unfolded boxes and a series of solids. And the office idiom insists that there is this kind of limited kit of parts, but also that the limited kit of parts stays very discrete. Like you can tell the difference between the unfolded boxes and the solids below. These ideas about discreteness make their way into representation, like people stand apart from the architecture, not only in terms of being separate entities, but are represented using a totally different set of means. And so it's not as though we begin with unfolded boxes and these little solids because we're deliberately trying to be willful. These are just the only intellectual means that our office has at its disposal in order to render the sets of desires that Danielle and Darren have given us. And so we are making an earnest attempt to satisfy the stipulations that they've given us as clients. But there's a kind of, let's say, a misregistration of our means for accomplishing design on top of the sets of desires that they have as a client. And so this misregistration continues as we get further and further into design. So what I just showed you were these 3D prints of early schemes. The design starts to get a little more specified. This is, let's say, 50% of the way through design. And the misregistration persists. So for instance, they've given us this stipulation that the house is to be both private, but for entertainment. When we start to render that through these kind of limited means that the office has, solids and boxes and discrete objects, it means for us that the front facade has to be incredibly blank for a house that's meant for entertaining, and that all of the articulation will start to happen toward the back, facing the pool and the guest house. It also means for us, working in this kind of design idiom, that the bedrooms are going to be the volumes that furnish privacy, pushed way to the front of the house, even though in a certain mode of conventional thinking, one might imagine the bedrooms to be the most private and interiorized parts of the house. Lastly, the misregistration means that although we are constantly trying our best to fold up the envelope, and here I'm showing you models nearer to the end of design, although we are trying to fold up the envelope to provide a kind of maximum degree of closeness against the outside, a kind of sense of security, this design idiom that we're working in always means a certain kind of porosity. So in the end, I would say that the client's desires have been written over in a language that is being supplied by our office and inside of a set of design principles that are being supplied by our office. Again, not a product of willfulness, but instead a product of two different sets of desires and capacities that are meeting one another and attempting to reconcile. I think this finds like it's sort of what I would call its fullest expression or its kind of logical extension in the design of the elevation that is, let's say, Danielle and Darren's identity with respect to the rest of the neighborhood. So the elevations we've designed are the way in which their house presents itself to other houses. And here you see us sort of doing our best to start to imitate the context of neighboring houses, the unrolled elevations of neighboring houses drawn next to our own. We're trying to imitate the kind of contextual clues of their roof lines or contextual cues of their roof lines. But again, we're doing it within this idiom that we bring to the table. And so at a certain logical extreme, we could say that Danielle and Darren's identity, insofar as it's conveyed to the rest of their neighborhood by the elevation of their house, is a kind of product of this misregistration between what they want us to do and what our office is capable of providing in return. And so how would I characterize this? It's a way of saying that the client and also the architect neither are entirely themselves. It's not right to call this selflessness or humility. Those aren't quite the right words, but it's openness for sure. And it's a two-way kind of openness between both client and architect. The second question I want to ask is, what is a dominant model? So when we're working on the house, we begin, as I've already said, in plan. We decide that we are going to multiply the open space of the side yards with a porous stripe down the middle that goes front to back on the lot. and then we're going to multiply the openness again with by forming a kind of cruciform in the interior. So there's another open patch that goes left, right. And then this will start to order the plan. I think in terms of like dominant models, it would be hard to argue that there is a more dominant model of a kind of point of beginning in architecture than to start with the plan, and that the cruciform shape is also dominant, sort of as a symbol, but also in terms of its long history of deployment in architecture. Lots of buildings have a cruciform plan. And then it has all of these like hyper-determined geometric characteristics. So cruciform plans divide things into 4 parts. Those 4 parts can receive various kinds of programmatic assignments. And so that's where I would say we're beginning like right at the center of what we would call a dominant model. On top of the cruciform, we've distributed 3 bands of program that correspond to 3 different spatial types. So in this diagram, you're looking at the house from the bottom up in worm's eye. Here are the bedrooms at front. They contain all of these objects that are associated with sleeping as a program. And we've treated them as what we're calling little shed rooms. So they're entirely bounded perimeters. In the middle, there are these solid chunks that contain service programs. So that's where a wall oven goes. Built-in sinks are contained in these solid boxes. Bathrooms, dishwashers, laundry machines. And we're treating these as freestanding objects. And then at the back, facing the backyard, there's this sort of third programmatic stripe that's spatially defined by what we're calling parenthetical walls. So they're open, like parentheses, and they loosely bracket space. And so there's always there's always either an open corner or there's only 3 walls that form an enclosure, leaving a 4th open side. In section, then what happens is that we begin on the ground with this stack of ground stuff. And then above it, there are a series of monopitch wedges. And atop those, there's a kind of third layer that's the big unfolded box. Let's take you guys right here. So here's this stuff that kind of pertains to the ground. It's those 3 programmatic stripes that interface with the 4-part system of the cross. And then there are these monopitched wedges on top of the ground stuff. And then on top of it all, there's this unfolded box. And there's a kind of slippage or misalignment that becomes exaggerated as we go up. So first, there's the kind of 3-part system of the stuff on the ground against the 4-part distribution of bays and the cross. Then there's a kind of misalignment of the wedges on top of this ground stuff. And so you can see that one of the wedges like overhangs the living room and also overhangs the pool outside. Another one, a little more difficult to see, that caps one of the bars filled with bedrooms, actually overhangs this front entry hallway. And then the slippages become even more extreme at the unfolded box, where it literally grabs up all of the remaining unenclosed space that hasn't been capped by these wedges and seals it up and provides a kind of double height area at the kitchen. And so although there are these incredibly discrete pockets, both in terms of the bay system formed by the cross and then these 3 programmatic stripes, those start to be remixed in terms of how programs and how spaces are associated with one another by the redistribution of elements above. And so we spend some time sort of thinking about how we would characterize this as a mode of projection. It's clearly not the kind of strict geometric projection of the plan up to the reflected ceiling plan. Instead, it's another form of projection that privileges like possible disjunctions, or let's say like possible dissimilarities between the plan and the reflected ceiling plan. And so in the language sort of internal to the office, we would say that the plan is sort of dreaming of possible reflected ceiling plans above it. And to the extent that the plan furnishes limits, we would think of these as actually sort of physical limits that the stuff above has to sort of hug or fit itself inside of a loose set of stipulations that are being projected upward from below on the ground. The last question I'd like to ask is, what is the center? And so in this house, maybe it's actually best if I show you on a piece of paper. In this house, the kitchen is adjacent to the intersection of the long and short axes of the cross. And that is also a kind of high point. That's where the entirety of the volume gets like about twice as high. So if over here, if over here you're looking at a space that's about 9 feet tall, here you're looking at a space that's about 17 or 18 feet tall. And I think it's fair to ask, like if you're at this sort of privileged point in the plan at the kitchen, are you at the center? And in purely geometric terms, like kind of, but also no, you're not at the center point of the lot. You're not quite at the center point of the cruciform that's set off slightly to one side. And there are lots of clues like given by the bedrooms, given by the bathrooms, that when you occupy those volumes, in fact, you're at the center of something. So what's unique about the kitchen is that you walk in and you turn around and you start to regard the rest of the house around you from a space of a kind of clearing, I would say. That's where the entire volume opens up. And all around you, the rest of the house presses up against this clearing. And so you can actually see the intrusion of the roof forms from outside. You can see materials being carried over from the outside and wrapping the interior. And so instead, I would say being in the middle, like the kitchen, is an occupation, or let's say a point of view of looking from the outside at things that were familiar from other vantages. From other vantages, you would have known them as bedrooms and bathrooms. But once you get to the outside, or once you get to the kitchen, instead what you see is a kind of press of things around you that no longer indicate their program. So here's, let's say, the corner of a bedroom that's equivalent to maybe any other volume that exposes its corner to the kitchen. And so we would like to think of the kitchen as regarding a series of, let's say, totems as you look at each of the four corners of the interior. They clearly have a kind of trabeated stacked order and a significance, but what exactly they're intending to communicate is not transparent to the person sitting on the inside. And so, I don't know, being in the kitchen is, what would I call it? Making at home in doubt, or maybe making a home out of doubt, insofar as you are here at the center and yet encountering everything as though from the outside. All right, let's put you guys over here. Okay, to wind up. So make a home of doubt. This is what I want to advocate. This is what queer architecture should do. It should ask how to make a durable, pleasurable form of doubt, how to put categories always at risk, but risk our own to the very same extent, to see things perpetually from the outside, even in places that most closely match the comforts of our own identity. I'm not prepared to present evidence for this claim, but I fear that architects, especially architects who practice queerness, have inherited the politics, but not necessarily the substance of a rhetoric from a very different time. I fear we have mapped the politics of these borrowed words onto a contemporary world that does not recognize them. When we try to describe what we want, what we are trying to achieve, our words are things like strangeness, instability, awkwardness, failure, oscillation, destabilization, dismantling. I hear these words deeply entrenched in the vocabulary of reviews and lectures. The politics of these words date, I think, to the second half of the last century, when modernism presented a clear set of targets for antagonism. It was our responsibility to struggle. Contemporary queer expertise, though, is not so much in precipitating antagonisms against, as it is about confident occupation of the uncertain aftermath of conflict. Our capacities to make a home in doubt, to find certainties and comfort in it, are perfectly suited for this cultural moment. Form is our most promising vehicle for affecting these politics. I understand that form is uncomfortable at present. It is too soon to say the word after the form drunkenness of the digital turn. Form is also declarative. It frequently relies on systems and categories. It is normative insofar as it hews to certain beliefs about what is valuable and good. And when forms are buildings, they last too long to stay relevant. For all these discomforts, form is the thing we can manufacture and insert into the world such that it operates independently of us and who we are. Audiences encounter our forms and, consciously or not, read them. This is to say that when audiences encounter forms, they are meeting something that is not themselves, and they must develop a position in response. This is good. At best, our forms will be models for how to doubt one's own position in the world and walk away smiling. Thanks.
Are you still there? Hey. Well, first of all, that went well despite the cell phone use. So it was maybe even better. And just so you know, Andres did have to go. So unfortunately, he's not here for the conversation. But I have a lot that I want to, that makes me think about, because I think in the introduction to today, I sort of articulated a few of my own doubts about how these things sort of fit together, about, let's say, my own identity and queer politics, and what that has to do, if anything, with the work that one may or may not do. And I like that you're sort of you're okay with trying to have a dominant model, and it's not so much about like kill all your parents. It's like accept the fact that there are perhaps parents, and correct me if I'm wrong, but like that you have to sort of do something with that on your own. It's something, reminds me of this quote actually by Felix Gonzalez Torres, when I forget the exact quote, but he said something like, "I don't care about killing my parents. You inherit what you inherit, and you are who you are, and you just kind of do the work that you do." But beyond that, it's sort of like what you're sort of calling for is a kind of refocusing on, I suppose, on form itself to some extent, as how we work as architects. And I was curious with a house. So like, there's two things. One, I think is the sense of how queerness works with us as architects, or whether it should. And the second, with the identity of the house, I'm curious about you do a lot to kind of talk about the roof in particular. And I'm very curious about this sort of the unfolding roof, which it sort of still to me is in that same world of like, of kinds of architecture that didn't ever need queerness to be spoken about, to do like a big folded roof, or to sort of think of it as a big cardboard box or something like that, that it would come from like a different way of thinking through it. And you could get similar effects, in covering those spaces by not doing an unfolded box, by having a little like eyebrow that sticks out, or by doing a lot of other things with the roof, let's say. And I'm just sort of, one thing I'm thinking of is like, why isn't the roof maybe also tied to things that are not just about the identity of that house, and do you need to speak about it that way? And I suppose you kind of didn't fully excuse it through that, but that's like one question I have. The second, and I'm like so interested in this, the home of doubt, and like when you're talking about the kitchen, the things that press in, they've lose their nomination, they've lose their identity as the living room or the bedroom. They've sort of become other things, and like that loss of being able to call it that thing or whatever it's supposed to normally be. To me, that's so beautiful. Like that seems something that form does so well, that architectural form does so well, is that sense of things being able to be understood in multiple ways, let's say. Sorry, I just spoke for a while, but I forgot where the question was, and I feel like there had been one, but I wanted to just acknowledge that I liked your doubt and the way that you sort of framed this around the set of questions. I thought that was quite generous, actually. But I don't know if you could respond to some of that somehow, if any of that made sense.
Yeah. So that's a very generous reading of my admittedly somewhat crippled presentation. And let's return maybe to your first question about the box, its utility, and the identity of the house. And I think here, maybe I veered off script to my own detriment a little bit. Like, I cannot underscore enough how earnestly our office is interested in discharging the wishes of our client, and how sort of seriously we take their desires. I think part of designing in response to a very generous brief of the kind that we got is to bring to the table the things that you understand best. And so we're not trying to be cagey with unfolded boxes. It really seems to us that when we say the word box in architecture, that we are trading between the box as a kind of abstract unit, like, oh, I'm going to stack up 500 boxes and those will be units of inhabitation, like an abstract chunk that someone gets inside. But then we're also very slippery, and architects say, like, that house is a box. And what they mean is that it's a hollow volume, probably made out of like type 5 construction, and has this kind of thin wall that surrounds empty space. And so that like slipperiness of architects' language when they use this word box has really captivated the office. And we have tried to find ways to make that slipperiness of meaning productive as we do our own sort of massing exercises and seek like expedient and efficient means of responding to clients. So of course, we're working in very simple ways when we mass out these houses, and we're using boxes to do it. And this is how we understand like a box to work. So I suppose it's from not a naive position, but one where we are selecting the instrument that we feel we know best, that has this sort of slippery set of meanings and spatial and volumetric properties, and it just seems like a really good instrument to use when you want to weld together like a series of gaps and also get like a kind of cavernous open space at the middle. Like what else would we do if you're our office and you bring this set of equipment to the table?
But the thing with the other thing that I think of when I think of the box, maybe a third reading of it, is also its relationship to orthographic drawings. That it, like that one of the many reasons that, for the last 30, 40 years, there's at least one discourse on the cube or the rectangular box or whatever, which is to sort of bring it out of plane, because it would somehow bring it out of the plan. It would bring it out of the section. It would bring it out of all of those orthographic drawings that traditionally produce boxes or planes or something like this. And so I don't know, when I read the kind of the roof fooled and all the things that you're saying, it seems like that's also like the one other way to begin to read some of that discussion is its, let's say, inability to fully be understood in a two-dimensional cut drawing, like that, some of that stuff. Like there's
I think your reading is absolutely right. I would just say it back to you in slightly different words. So if we're beginning with the box as the kind of crown to the roof assembly, it means that we have 4 very obvious elevations. But if we want to be contextually sensitive, like imitate the roof forms of the other buildings in the neighborhood, because of the way the box is situated on these sloped surfaces, when we fold to imitate, we can literally only produce that kind of contextual image in projection. In the round, it starts to get shaky and sort of fall apart, and you see the oblique projections onto the surfaces below. But if you kind of imagine like a kind of non-perspectival view as you're standing on the street, then you get like more or less exactly what the neighbors have.
Well, that's interesting. It's sort of, it seems like the other dominant model then of the project, which is, I think you said it was like the essentially 4 square. I forget exactly the subdivided plan that you were describing, but the other sort of way to say the dominant model is the role of these projections or orthographic drawing. I think we have to move on, but I want to say that like I think the other thing that to me is a little bit interesting about what you're sort of suggesting is it's a little bit of a love for architecture, which I kind of love too, and it makes me think a little bit about some of the conversation in the first session, which had to do with, let's say, producing new archives and producing other or not having canons, things like this. That some of what you're sort of perhaps suggesting is the sense that there might be not necessarily no canon or a canon, but somehow something else. And I don't know how your work sort of describes itself in relationship to that, but like the need for a dominant model or the use of the dominant model and the claim towards it, I think is an important message that you're sort of putting out there.
Yeah, or to say it in a way that's maybe slightly fuzzier and less dogmatic, I would just say like we're interested in cultivating like a very serious understanding of our tools, and also, frankly, like an unashamed love of the tools that we bring to the table. And we freely acknowledge that they are limited, but we love them sort of nonetheless. And it's like the depth of and authenticity of that affection, like that's the measure of whether or not we're being good actors.
Great. Well, thank you, Andrew. Thank you for, even though we had technical issues, for still pulling through. I really appreciate it. I actually think it made it even better. Maybe it was really great to begin with, but it was great.
So great. Yeah, just imagine what it could have been.
Even better. I really appreciate it. So thank you. And thanks to Andres, who had to leave early. We got delayed for a number of reasons. So I appreciate everybody hanging in there with us. Thanks, Andrew. And I guess to the audience, we're going to start the next group just a few minutes late, very, very briefly later. But maybe we'll be right back with the next group. So
thanks, David. Good to see you.
Thanks.